On the 15th of July 1992, 23-year-old Rachel Nickell, a young mother out walking with her son, was savagely murdered on Wimbledon Common in southwest London.
She had over 40 stab wounds to her body. It was a scene out of a horror movie.
Within days, the murder was front-page news, with the press and public clamouring for her killer to be caught.
It seems, rightly or wrongly, that there's a massive jolt to society, that life is much more dangerous than it used to be.
The police would launch an audacious operation to trap the killer, an operation that would lead to an innocent man being charged with murder. The killing of Rachel Nickell was a crime that shook Britain.
Good evening. The savage knife murder of a young mother in broad daylight stunned detectives in London today.
Rachel Nickell was 23 years old, with a life of promise ahead of her. She lived with her partner Andre and a 2-year-old son Alex in Balham, South London. On the morning of the 15th of July 1992, she was getting ready to take Alex for a walk. Less than 2 hours later, she would be dead, brutally murdered in a popular beauty spot. Across London, on the tough Alton estate in Roehampton, less than a mile from Wimbledon Common, local man Colin Stagg had woken up early and was preparing to take his dog for a walk.
I initially did go on the common very early in the morning, just to walk my dog. I remember I had a very bad headache that morning, so what would have normally been quite a long walk, which was a daily thing, I only did a short walk, just around a little pond called Skio Pond, and then back home again.
With his headache getting worse, Colin decided to take some painkillers and settle down on his sofa to sleep it off. The time is around 9:25. As Colin slept, Rachel, Alex and their dog Molly had set off across the common for a stroll through the trees. As they enjoyed the early summer sun, they were totally unaware of the killer stalking them.
The area of the common, as I recall, it was really quite wide open. I think the area had some tree cover around it, but essentially this was broad daylight. This was not an area you would think twice about going to.
She was killed on a path which was well frequented, probably less than 200 yards from an open green area on Wimbledon Common where mothers were walking their children. The attack was so ferocious, one of the blows that cut her throat, to silence her before the main attack, almost decapitated her. She had over 40 stab wounds to her body and throat. It was a scene out of a horror movie.
Police soon flooded the common, quickly realizing that their crime scene stretched to over 1,000 acres of woodland, containing over 500 people on the morning of the murder. A murder that had only one eyewitness, a 2-year-old boy that had seen his mother butchered. Back at home, Colin Stagg had woken up and was feeling better. With the day warming up, he changed his clothes and decided to take his dog for a longer walk, a decision that would affect the rest of his life.
I walked under the underpass at Putney Vale Cemetery into the common, and I saw a uniformed police officer standing on the common side. He advised me not to go onto the common because there'd been an incident. I basically asked him what it was, and he said they'd found the body of a young girl. I told him that I'd been on the common that morning, and he asked if I'd seen anything suspicious, and I just said no. He asked me for my name and address in case they needed to question me later, which I freely gave, and that was it. I just basically went home.
The Metropolitan Police assembled a crack team of detectives to work on the case.
From the start, the Nickell murder squad was hindered by lack of evidence. There was a minute speck of what at the time was regarded as organic material, but the science of the early 90s was not enough to mark it as DNA. So the police are starting from a very difficult place.
She was 23 when she died. She was a shining light, a bright star in my life and everybody who knew her.
After a month of inquiries and hundreds of interviews, the detectives still seemed to be getting nowhere. They couldn't even categorically say whether Rachel's killer was male or female. Faced with a stalling investigation, the police took the unusual step of calling in a criminal profiler to provide a psychological assessment of their killer.
In the UK, psychological profiling was new. I was very personally cynical about what a profiler could offer, although not dismiss it. They're not going to be able to name the killer. What they might be able to do is put someone in a bracket and say, well, this type of individual is the sort of thing they could do.
The man the detectives turned to was Paul Britton, a renowned criminal psychologist who had worked on several high-profile cases in the past, including the abduction of Stephanie Slater. Working hand in hand with the inquiry team, Britton was asked to profile Rachel Nickell's killer.
There were two profiles written, one which I guess we might call a demographic profile, someone between 20 and 30 with isolated hobbies who probably lives on his own and probably doesn't live very far from the common. And the second one was this so-called sexual fantasy profile where he talked about the sort of things the offender would be interested in, which was sexually sadistic fantasies, and he actually listed some of these. Would be interested in knives and the occult and that type of thing.
The profile provided by Mr. Britton bore an uncanny resemblance to Colin's own life.
The profiles, along with a photo fit of a possible suspect, were featured in a national TV appeal. The appeal prompted hundreds of calls from members of the public, and many were claiming they knew who the man in the photo fit was.
The police were inundated with calls, putting a name to this face, Colin Francis Stagg.
Early in the morning, it was about 8, 9 o'clock I think it was, someone was knocking on my door. I opened it and it was plainclothes officers. And they said they wanted to question me in regard to the Rachel Nickell murder.
To be fair to the police, they had interviewed other suspects. They had followed up other leads. But as time wore on, those leads and those suspects petered out. The only man who figured large and was to do so for the next 2 years was Colin Stagg.
Come on, Colin, don't waste our time. We don't come around here.
I'd never been arrested for anything in my life at that time, and being accused of something like that, and it was like I was in a different world. It was strange. Lots of police officers came in, they searched my home, top to bottom. I had a couple of books about the occult and stuff like that, and they focused on that. After they searched my place, they took me to the Wimbledon police station and they held me for 3 days.
As the police began to question their suspect, they were presented with a huge piece of luck. Colin Stagg was about to reveal a piece of information that would convince detectives he was the killer. On the 15th of July, 1992, Rachel Nickell was walking with her 2-year-old son, Alex, on Wimbledon Common. In a few short minutes, a laughter-filled stroll in a popular beauty spot would be turned into a scene of horror. Her son, ripped from her arms, would be the only witness to the dreadful attack.
The image of her, the beautiful blonde model, is an iconic image now, and it seems to speak to the loss of innocence of a period of time when a young woman couldn't take her child out in the middle of the day on a summer's day. So it became one of these cases that put incredible pressure on the police.
Faced with an almost complete lack of eyewitness and forensic evidence, the police asked criminal psychologist Paul Britton to devise a profile of the killer. This profile, along with a well-publicised photo fit of a suspect seen near the murder site, led to the spotlight falling on local man Colin Stagg, who lived a few minutes' walk from Wimbledon Common.
I can see why Colin Stagg rose to the top of this inquiry. He almost offered himself up, quite frankly. He was on the Common at the time. He's a known loner, nothing wrong with that, but sometimes with that, perceived to be just a little bit odd in some way or another.
Stagg had admitted being on the Common on the morning of the murder, and this, along with evidence found during the search of his flat, made him the prime suspect. Colin Stagg was arrested at his home, taken to Wimbledon Police Station and questioned.
I'd never been arrested before for any crime, and it was very, very scary.
Amazingly, for the police officers involved, he talked frankly and openly. He didn't deny anything, but other than to insist that he had not murdered this young mother.
As police continued to question Colin, a search of past incidents on the Common delivered a breakthrough.
They discovered a sighting by a woman of a man who was lying naked on the Common, who she claimed exposed himself to her.
Basically, I was just doing nude sunbathing, which I did in regular spot every summer, and it was an area used by nude sunbathers. I pleaded guilty to it because I thought, well, basically, you know, I've been advised to by my solicitor, and I just wanted to get out of there. I didn't want these things to drag on, so I thought, get rid of it. I got a fine for £200, and after that, I was released after 3 days.
That decision was to have long and lasting effects on the case and his life.
By naively admitting to the indecent exposure charge, Colin Stagg fueled the police's notion that he possessed the characteristics laid down by Paul Britton's profile of the killer. As Colin returned to his life on the Alton estate, where he assumed the traumas of the past months were behind him for good, a seemingly innocent search for companionship years before the killing of Rachel Nickell would come back to haunt him.
I think it was about 2 years prior to the murder of Rachel Nickell. I answered a dating advert for friendship, and so I wrote a letter to Julie Pines. We got on okay, you know, we chatted on the telephone at first, and we seemed to be okay. And then, being a normal red-blooded man, you know, I thought, you know, this could go a bit further. So I just chanced my arm, really, and wrote her a sexual letter. It was just of a mild sexual fantasy of meeting a woman in the open air, getting on together and having sex together in the open air. And she kept that letter for 2 years, and she contacted the police when I was arrested for those 3 days, and that was it. And the police, once they read that letter, and of course Rachel Nickell was murdered in the Woodlands, they seemed to find a connection with that.
After a detailed examination of the letter from Julie Pines, the police were now even more certain that Colin had murdered Rachel Nickell. They were still, however, completely unable to prove it. Faced with an ever-mounting pressure from both senior officers and the public, the inquiry team hit upon a daring idea.
It was believed, now we know hugely problematically, that it would be useful to get an undercover operative in there to evaluate whether Stagg had any guilty knowledge of the case.
The inquiry team wasted no time in recruiting a star female undercover officer known during and after the operation as Lizzie James. With her in place, and after lengthy consultations with Paul Britton, Operation Edsel, as it was codenamed, began. The carefully concocted plan, made with the approval of senior Metropolitan Police officers and lawyers, was that Lizzie should write to Colin and earn his trust in the hope that he would reveal some intimate knowledge of the crime.
I received a letter from a woman calling herself Lizzie James, and she claimed that she was a friend of Julie Pines, and she had read the letter and she found it interesting, and she wanted to get to know me.
The first letter was something like, "Dear Colin, you might remember a lady called Julie Pines."
Dear Colin, I hope you're not offended by this intrusion, as we've never met before.
Julie was fairly closed-minded. I'm a lot more open-minded, and basically I want to start a dialogue with you. Of course, Stagg, 30-year-old guy, getting a bit of attention from a woman, writes back.
Dear Lizzie, thank you so much for your letter, which I read with great interest.
We struck up a conversation. I sent letters to her, she'd send letters to me.
I'm sure your fantasies hold no bounds, and you're as broad-minded and uninhibited as I am.
Some of the early letters by Stagg show his degree of naivety, where he talks about making parsnip wine, and we'll go out on the veranda and have our parsnip wine, and I'll kiss you and cuddle you, and it's all pretty benign stuff. And then in a very significant letter that she writes back, she says, I need you to show me what a real man is.
The things that happened when I was with this man were not what normal people would like. And even though these things are bad and I feel guilty, I can never forget how exhilarating they made me feel.
Now, there's only so many ways you can take that, so unsurprisingly, in the next letter, Stagg plays back that exact verbatim sentence. I'll show you who a real man is. And then in the next letter, Lizzie James writes back, I need to feel defenceless and humiliated. And guess what? In the next letter, Stagg uses those exact terms, defenceless and humiliated.
In all my letters, I would always say, is this the kind of thing you mean? Is this the kind of thing that you like? If not, I apologise, you know, because I was a lot younger, never had a real sexual relationship with a woman, so I would have told any woman anything what they wanted to hear if I thought I was going to have sex back then.
The exchange of letters continued, and the content quickly became more sexual and violent. To the detectives, it seemed Stagg was playing right into their hands. Encouraged by the results, they decided to take the operation a step further and have the couple meet.
I remember the day clearly. I thought she was late. Then I saw this woman, long blonde hair, quite attractive. So I said, you know, excuse me, are you Lizzie James? And she said she was, and she realised who I was.
Nice to meet you.
So, you got here all right? You found it all right?
Yeah, eventually. Sorry if I'm a bit late.
And that was the first meeting we had.
His first encounter with Lizzie was not the private affair that Colin had hoped for. The park was full of undercover officers, watching every move he made, each of them fully aware that one of their colleagues was meeting with a supposed sadistic killer. Over lunch, Lizzie James wasted no time in appealing to what the team thought was Colin's dark side.
That's when she told me she had a dark secret.
I've got quite an extreme appetite for some things.
Her ex-boyfriend was into black magic and stuff, and she claimed that she had done a human sacrifice of a pregnant woman and a baby.
Yeah, we did. And things got pretty heated, and yeah, we screwed around.
At first I thought, oh, she's a nutter, you know, she's off her head, but she was very attractive. And again, all I was thinking about was like, yeah, you know, just in one ear and out the other.
Ever eager to impress Lizzie, Colin responded to her dark secret with a violent fantasy of his own. It wasn't long before their exchanges turned to the murder on Wimbledon Common.
I told her, I think I was on the second or the third meeting, that I had been arrested for the Rachel Nickell murder. And she found that very exciting. Lizzie James wanted me to be the murderer. She said she could only be with a man who could have committed that crime and to have sex with that man. And I just kept saying, no, sorry, it's not me. You know, I kept apologising and saying, you know, sorry, it's not me, I didn't do it.
Throughout the entire operation, Colin Stagg never once suggested he had anything to do with the Nickell murder. But despite this, the sexual content of his letters to Lizzie James were exactly what Paul Britton and the police thought they would see from the killer. On the 17th of August 1993, Stagg was rearrested on suspicion of murder.
Myself and my solicitor, we sat in a room being interviewed by the police, and they were reading some of my letters out that I'd written to Lizzie James.
Not only do you want to befriend this certain lady, what shocks me is what you're prepared to do to her as well in the name of fun. Have a look at that one.
Yeah, I felt obviously very small because I thought, you know, there were personal letters between two consenting adults.
No comment.
And it was at that point one officer left the room and he came in with Lizzie James.
Hello, Colin. Remember me?
I knew straight away then that she was part of this. I couldn't say anything, because I was just saying no comment all the time. But what I really wanted to say was like, well, you fucking started this, You wrote to me, I didn't write to you. So that was it. And then I was charged with the murder of Rachel Nickell.
With their prime suspect safely behind bars, the murder squad celebrated a job well done. However, what they didn't and couldn't know was that for the past months, all their efforts had been focused on the wrong man. The real killer of Rachel Nickell was still at large, and in the autumn of 1993, he was preparing to strike again. Detectives investigating the murder of Rachel Nickell on Wimbledon Common in 1992 had spent over a year hunting her killer. With the help of a criminal profiler, the police had launched an audacious undercover operation to trap their prime suspect, Colin Stagg. A female plainclothes officer had befriended Stagg, and through a series of letters and meetings, the police had amassed evidence they felt proved him to be the killer. Now, with Stagg charged with murder and remanded in custody, the detectives could prepare for the trial. However, what the inquiry team didn't realize was that they had been focused on the wrong man. From the first moment that Colin had appeared on their radar, their judgment had been clouded, and clues to the real killer's identity had been missed. In the summer of 1989, a brutal rape in Plumstead, southeast London, marked the start of a series of attacks that would blight the area for the next 4 years.
A woman with children in the house was getting the kids ready for school, and the back door was left open. She turned around after drying her hair to see the offender standing there with a knife, threatening her and threatening to attack the children if she didn't comply.
And that rape was the first of what became known as the Green Chain Rapes, which was a series of attacks along Green Chain Walk in southeast London. These rapes went on for a number of years and no one was caught for them.
Tragically, the Green Chain Rapes could have been stopped after the first attack. The police received a call about the Plumstead rape in August 1989. The caller was the rapist's mother, and her son had just confessed to her. His name was Robert Napper.
He confessed to her that he'd raped a woman, and his mother took him at his word and went to the police and said, "Look, my son's confessed to raping a woman. Has anybody been raped recently around Plumstead Common?"
The police checked their records, but in what would be a tragic oversight, no trace of an attack could be found. Had the crime been properly investigated, one of the worst killers in British history could have been stopped in his tracks.
Robert Napper is one of a very unusual and small set of offenders, mercifully rare, that really are, well, it's basically known as a sexual sadist, a sexually sadistic killer. There's some suggestion that he was abused before the age of 10, and apparently by someone quite close to him, although specifically who that is, we don't know. I think what's significant about him as a child and as an adult is this isolation. Isolation from his peers, isolation from friends, and isolation from family, which got more and more extreme also throughout his criminal career. We also know that he had Asperger's, which is a learning difficulty as well, which probably added to that isolation.
The Green Chain Walk, a tranquil series of linked parks in southeast London, was, during the early 1990s, the scene of some of the most terrifying rapes London had ever witnessed. The attacks would continue for months, increasing in brutality, until in the early summer of 1992, just weeks before Rachel Nickell would be killed, Napper would attack a woman walking with a child.
Napper jumped out at her, pushed her to the ground, tried to strangle her in front of her child and brutally raped her while she pleaded for him not to kill her. The similarities between this and the Nickell murder a few weeks later, when you look back on it, are so stark. But it didn't seem to be picked up at the time. I mean, hindsight, as we say, is a marvellous thing, but it was very similar, and the crucial thing was she had her child with her.
Not only were the green chain attacks not linked to the murder of Rachel Nickell, a lack of thorough police work ensured that Napper was free to carry on his reign of terror. Twice he was asked to give a DNA sample after his neighbours positively identified him from a photo fit of the green chain suspect. In both cases, he didn't turn up at the police station. Incredibly, he wasn't pursued. In November 1993, 16 months after Rachel Nickell's killing and with Colin Stagg awaiting trial for murder, London was rocked by news of another terrible crime.
What has shocked police is the ferocity of the murders. A senior officer said Sam Bissett's injuries were horrific.
Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter Jasmine lived together with Samantha's boyfriend Conrad Ellum in Plumstead, southeast London.
Samantha was a very strong personality. Before she had Jasmine, she was quite wayward. But then when she had Jasmine, it gave her more focus in life, I guess. And she was a very devoted mother. I should remember Jasmine. She's an adorable little child. I mean, she was a lovely girl. I'd take her to the swings and she'd just think it was brilliant. She'd just think it was an amazing day out, just going to the swings for a couple of hours. And, you know, she was so happy.
As Samantha and Jasmine carried on with their lives, what they couldn't have known was that Robert Napper had already begun stalking them.
She never had curtains, you know, and sometimes she'd walk around the flat naked. And I'd say, look, you know, you should be careful here. There could be, like, a peeping Tom looking in. And it was only a week or so before the murder when she did actually see someone looking in through a bedroom window one night. I think after that she was a bit more careful, but I guess it was too late by then. The day I found Sam and Jasmine, I was staying at my father's house in Sidcup, and I planned to call in the flat on the way to work. I let myself in, and straight away, I mean, I saw this stain on the carpet and went into the kitchen to get something to clean up this stain. I thought I'd better help clean that up. And all the kitchen was in chaos, where Sam's clothes had been pulled out of the cupboard and the floor was just carpeted with clothes. And then walked into the front room and saw, I mean, Sam had actually been covered over, so there wasn't much to see, but I'm standing there looking at this little pile of clothes and all the bloodstains and things, and it took quite a while for me to sort of actually grasp what had happened. And then thought, well, what about Jasmine? I felt bad that I hadn't even thought about it. I thought I'd phone the police without even checking on Jasmine. I thought she might still be alive. Jasmine was in the bed with the covers over her. And for a second I thought maybe she's still alive, but then there was no movement, she wasn't breathing. So then I phoned the police.
The investigation into the Bissett murders was headed up by Detective Superintendent Mickey Banks.
Well, when I first got there, it was a block of council flats. Scenes of crime people were already there. I was given access to the place, went through, and to be met by this horrendous scene. It was, I would say, the most gruesome scene I've ever attended. You know, I did 32.5 years. I'd never seen a scene like that, or an accident, or anything as bad as this. Obviously, the body had been left there to be displayed, as if to say, look what I've done, look what I'm capable of, and I immediately thought this has got to be some nutter.
As scenes of crime officers examined the flat, they began to piece together what they thought had happened.
Sam's going about her business with Jasmine in the house, and there's a knock on the door. At that point, a very sudden, violent attack takes place where Napper immediately stabs her with a knife, takes her into the lounge, and then commits some horrific acts of mutilation on her. Very shortly after that, also rapes and murders Jasmine, a 4-year-old girl. So a really horrendous and horrific offence.
One of the first things that struck Mickey Banks was that his case could be linked to the Green Chain rapes. To test this theory, he enlisted the help of the criminal profiler who had worked on the Green Chain rape inquiry and the Rachel Nickell murder investigation, Paul Britton.
The amazing thing about Paul Britton's involvement was that he was involved as an advisor on the Green Chain rapes. He was an advisor on the Bissett murder, and he was an advisor in the Stagg case. And at no point does he talk about the possibility of them being linked. And he worked on all three cases, and Napper walked through all three of them, completely unseen.
By early 1994, there were 3 different police inquiries running in South London, all independently and unknowingly investigating the crimes of one man, Robert Napper. The Green Chain team had ruled out Napper as a suspect for being too tall. Tellingly, they had not pursued him when he had twice failed to provide a DNA sample. Mickey Banks had also invited the Rachel Nickell murder squad to Plumstead to discuss whether their respective crimes could be linked.
They'd already charged Stagg, and they were convinced that they had the right man. This was the attitude I got from their officers when they came to visit us, and we discussed both cases, but they would only tell me what they wanted me to know. They were convinced Stagg was their murderer. It was as simple as that.
Paul Britton, the one man who had intimate knowledge of both cases, reinforced the lack of a connection between the Nickell and Bissett murders.
I think Mickey Banks says to Paul Britton, are they not linked? And Paul Britton says, no, they're not linked because it doesn't have the same degree of frenzy. And my answer to that is, well, it's pretty simple, that if you've got a victim inside a house and in a confined area, you can do more or less what you want with them, and you can express whatever weird, sexually deviant fantasies you have.
Meanwhile, the Bissett murder squad had received the break they had been waiting for. In a twist of fate, the fingerprints of victim Samantha Bissett were uncannily similar to those of Robert Napper, and in the first sweep of the crime scene, they were assumed to be the same prints. However, a re-examination had spotted the differences, and detectives now had a fingerprint of their killer.
There was a fingerprint found which matched about 6 or 7 points of Napper's fingerprints. This was found on the balcony outside the address, and was subsequently found to be partially comparable to him. He became a very good suspect for us.
The police had his fingerprints on file from a number of different offences. So as soon as they realised that these were someone else's prints, they looked on their computer and his name came up.
Not only did Robert Napper appear in the system, it emerged after his conviction that police files were littered with clues that pointed to him being a depraved sex offender. Clues that were, at the time, largely ignored.
Robert Napper had cropped up on the police radar at least 8 times before he murdered Samantha Bissett and her daughter. And I think most significantly is in 1992 when he was arrested for stalking a civilian employee at the police station in Plumstead. And police went round to his flat and searched his flat. They found an A to Z with pages marked in it of Plumstead Common. Marked and annotated in the side were comments about women being covered up in cling film and women being abused and violent acts towards women. He didn't make any links with the Green Chain rapes, with anything else. And then he was released and there he was back on the streets again.
Thankfully, the detectives investigating the Bissett murders 2 years later were more attentive, and Mickey Banks and his team spent months assembling evidence against Napper. Along with the fingerprint, they found a bloody footprint in Samantha Bissett's kitchen that they matched to a pair of Napper's shoes. This, along with reported sightings of Robert Napper in the area at the time of the murders, was enough for Banks.
Well, his interview was stone cold. He seemed as if he was looking down on us, that he knew something we didn't know, and he seemed, to my mind, that he was sort of, you're never going to find out, I'm who I am, I'm better than you. In his own mind, he was laughing at us.
In May 1994, Robert Napper was charged with the murders of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett. A DNA sample taken at the time also proved conclusively that Napper was the Green Chain rapist. He was placed on remand awaiting trial. Across London, another remand prisoner, Colin Stagg, was about to have his day in court. Charged with the murder of Rachel Nickell, it wouldn't just be Stagg on trial. Also under scrutiny would be the Metropolitan Police themselves and the audacious operation to ensnare their suspect. In July 1992, 23-year-old mother Rachel Nickell was murdered on Wimbledon Common. Detectives investigating the horrific crime used a female undercover police officer to befriend prime suspect Colin Stagg and earn his trust, in the hope that he would either confess to the crime or reveal evidence that he was involved. After 28 weeks, Operation Edsel, as it was known, ended with the police confident that they had gathered enough evidence to prove Stagg was guilty. Charged with murder, he was remanded in custody, awaiting trial.
After 14 months on remand in Wandsworth Jail, Colin Stagg arrived at the Old Bailey.
Going up into the courts is a very frightening thing. I mean, especially if you know you're innocent.
The police and the prosecution seemed quite confident with the material they'd got. And yet I was talking to sort of experienced court reporters and other crime correspondents who were sort of looking at each other thinking, how are they going to get away with this?
Colin's defence team had employed a series of experts to analyse Operation Edsel and its findings. They quickly realised it was littered with problems.
In my analysis of what Stagg revealed, there is actually nothing very unusual at all. There are several pathways that Stagg tries to satisfy Lizzie James, where he'll say, you know, I'm kind of interested in this, are you?
I'm so glad that you like my letters and that you too are as broad-minded and uninhibited as me. I can't wait to read some of your fantasies.
And he's trying to feel out what she's kind of interested in. And of course, where he hits gold is where she reinforces him, if you like, and throws him a bone every time he says something which is either violent or sexually sadistic.
I believe I will only ever feel fulfilled again if I meet a man who has the same history as me.
He talks about another man using a knife on a woman, on the common. And then, of course, bingo, the inquiry team think this is exactly what we thought we'd see. But it's a completely self-fulfilling prophecy because they only saw what they wanted to see by virtue of only reinforcing those elements that got them there.
After listening to the evidence against Colin Stagg, the judge in the hearing had decided that enough was enough, and he wasted no time in throwing out the evidence from the undercover operation, dismissing it as a honey trap.
As the detective in charge of that, you could not have listened to the judge's words and be in any doubt that he was not only dismissing the case, he was seriously angry about the way in which Colin Stagg had been led.
With their case in tatters, the Rachel Nickell murder squad were left to reflect on the events of the past 2 years. The team had taken over 4,500 statements, and the inquiry was said to have cost over £3 million. Despite the murder investigation being at the time the most expensive in British criminal history, the squad were left with nothing.
You wonder why did no one say, hold on, what's the judge going to think of this?
Colin Stagg left the Old Bailey after 14 months in prison, a free man. The judge's ruling meant that his case wouldn't be heard by a jury. But Colin was about to face a different trial, this time by the media and the public.
When Colin Stagg was released from prison, he was mobbed. The pictures, we all know the pictures of him coming out of court and being mobbed. And instead of being treated as an innocent man, he was treated as a killer who'd got off.
The judge recognised that there was never any evidence against me.
All the crowds were there and police on horseback, and everybody was just shouting out, and all I can hear is like, you know, hang him, guilty, guilty, hang him.
Minutes later, a statement was read out by Rachel Nickell's father.
I understand that the police will now keep the files on my daughter's murder open, but they are not looking for anyone else.
Releasing a statement that is so absolutely positive that we are not looking for anything else, that is a big message to deliver. You are saying to everyone out there, we know who this man is.
The law has been upheld, but where is the justice?
I'm surprised we ever made that statement.
Colin Stagg returned to his flat and would spend the next 14 years as a social pariah. To most people, he was the man who got away with murder. In the autumn of 1995, the focus was back on the Old Bailey, this time for the trial of Robert Napper, charged with the murders of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett. As the prosecution made the final touches to its case, the detectives received some unexpected news.
We got a phone call to say he was going to plead guilty, he was going to plead diminished responsibility. What did we think of that? And I said I was quite satisfied with it. I mean, I believe he was diminished. That there was he wasn't so mad that he didn't know what he was doing. He knew what he was doing, but there was something totally wrong with him.
In October 1995, Robert Napper pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He also confessed to 1 rape and 2 attempted rapes. He was sent to Broadmoor High Security Hospital indefinitely. The relatives of Samantha and Jasmine left court to rebuild their shattered lives.
It's strange how odd little things can remind me sometimes. Just a particular song on the radio that Sam liked, or there's always things like that. And it's always strange. I don't go over to Plumstead that much, but I do sometimes still go over past the flat, and it is always strange to walk past it and see the place. I should remember Jasmine. She's an adorable little child. I mean, she was a lovely girl.
The relatives of Rachel Nickell had no such closure. It would be another 7 years until a breakthrough in the case was found. In 2002, a case review team began poring over the evidence amassed in the decade since Rachel's murder. Every witness statement was re-looked at, and known offenders and possible suspects were re-examined. One of the first names that was flagged up was a sexually sadistic killer currently detained in Broadmoor, Robert Napper. At the same time, scientists were taking advantage of rapid advances in technology to review the forensic evidence found on Rachel Nickell's body.
There was a small amount of DNA on Rachel Nickell's jogging pants, and that was tested, and you are able from that now, although they weren't then, to rule people out, and Stagg was ruled out as being a forensic link to that DNA. The second piece of evidence was there were some very small paint flecks that were found in Alex Hanscom's, the little child's, hair, that they were able to link and actually match to paint flecks on Robert Napper's metal toolbox.
Further analysis of the DNA proved that Robert Napper had been in contact with Rachel Nickell on the day she died. The paint flecks found in her son Alex's hair were the final confirmation. Armed with this new evidence, Robert Napper was charged with the murder of Rachel Nickell. He appeared at the Old Bailey on the 18th of December, 2008.
He sat there and he didn't flinch, and he was a kind of presence of evil. I don't often say this, but he appeared to be like that, and it was the most tense courtroom I've ever been in, actually, and it really brought tears to your eyes, because then you could just see her parents finally, they'd got the right man, and it was really, really moving, actually.
Robert Napper pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Rachel Nickell on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He was sent back to Broadmoor, with a judge stating that he was unlikely ever to be released. Napper's admission of guilt brought to a close one of the most notorious cases in British criminal history.
It's since emerged that in August 1993, a knife was found on Wimbledon Common, near where Rachel Nickell was murdered. That knife was matched to Robert Napper when he was arrested in 1994. And again, nothing was done. Stagg was in jail on remand, nothing was done. So they had a knife with his fingerprints on, they had clues as to his stalking grounds, his raping grounds in his A to Z. They had all the evidence of a violent stalker, rapist, potentially killer, and they didn't put 2 and 2 together. I think that was just bad policing, total incompetence.
But Scotland Yard was listening, and the Nickell case, along with other high-profile crimes, led to dramatic changes in tactics.
Since the Rachel Nickell murder, the way murders are investigated have changed beyond recognition. Nowadays, you have dedicated murder investigation teams who are specialists. And with that, what has evolved from that is probably the most effective way of investigating murder anywhere in the world.
Colin Stagg, for so long at the heart of the case, would receive over £700,000 in compensation from the Home Office, as well as an apology from the Metropolitan Police. The shadow of the murder, however, has stayed with him.
There are still people today who don't know that they've actually got the man who did kill Rachel Nickell. They always say to me, like, you know, did they ever get the bloke who did it?
He was, for years, treated as a pariah, and his life was ruined. You know, he wasn't serving a sentence inside, but he was serving a sentence outside. And had Napa never been caught, you know, Colin Stagg would still be the man who killed Rachel Nickell to this day, I think.
Today's best mix for Huddersfield, Halifax, Bradford and Keighley. We are the pulse of West Yorkshire. 1 o'clock, Gareth has the news.
In 2009 and 2010, the streets of Bradford in Yorkshire became part of a crime so horrific it sent shockwaves throughout the world.
Well, I'm misanthropic. I don't have much time for the human race.
He was weedy and needy. He was the ultimate banality of evil.
A crazed killer, fueled by the need for notoriety and fame.
We sat feet away from him and he gave out his name as a Crossbow Cannibal.
This is somebody who was almost like a wannabe serial killer. He wanted his 15 minutes in the spotlight.
3 women vanished without a trace. Their dreadful fate was to unravel in the most extraordinary way imaginable.
The means by which he would kill his victims was chilling enough, but he may also have eaten parts of his victims' bodies.
A member of the public had reported seeing body parts.
My daughter's piece is still missing. What I've got are my daughter. I can't bury my daughter.
A murderer so sadistic he'd sickened the very fabric of society, making this a crime that shook Britain. Homefield Court, Bradford, West Yorkshire. The caretaker on duty is routinely reviewing the CCTV within the building when he makes a shocking discovery. But the roots of this terror started many months before. Susan Rushworth was 43 years old and had been selling her body on the streets for 3 years.
We found out it's because people saw her in the red light area. It's on a main bus route through Bradford. She was just seen, stood waiting to be picked up. That was sad. That's not what we could do to help. As much as she'd stop and ask her to stop it, she couldn't do. She was so dependent on the drugs. And it's the only way she could get the money.
Heroin was ruling Susan's existence. Before her drug addiction, life was very different.
Me and Susan were close growing up because there was such a short age gap between us, around 18 months between me and Susan. We had a pleasant upbringing. We lived in a country location. She got married in her early 20s and she had a family and she was really happy. She had a good life with her husband and the children.
But despite the family existence, a change in fate in her 30s led Susan down a very different path.
I was quite heartbroken, but she kept in touch with her ex-husband. She soon found a new boyfriend, and she seemed to be getting on really well. She had another child to this boyfriend. And that relationship broke down. I think that's when trouble started with the drugs.
At 35, Susan was a single mother to 3 children and introduced into a lifestyle that was to spiral out of control.
The family knew nothing about heroin or cocaine or anything, or where you'd even get it from. Come as a surprise to us all, really. I just never understood why. But then we did find out she'd been introduced by
a boyfriend at the time. She'd go on the street until she earned enough money to buy the drugs she needed. Then she'd take the drugs and sleep it off, and that'd be the day through.
Look at Susan, you look so ill.
Come to a point where my mum got desperate. She paid for Susan into rehab.
I promise.
It seemed to work at first, and she kept off the drugs, and then within 3 months she was back on the drugs. Even I think the habit even got harder and stronger.
In desperation, Susan worked the red light district of Bradford, selling her body to pay for her addiction to heroin. The city's area for prostitution lies on the outskirts in an area called Manningham, a soulless part of town where men seek sexual gratification.
I think she tried to hide the fact that she was earning money by being a prostitute. She'd say she was waiting for a bus to go and see my mother, or waiting to go somewhere on a bus, because it was near the bus stop where she'd stand and wait for punters, I think they call them. But in their hearts, I think everybody knew what she was waiting for.
This is the Pulse of West Yorkshire. Good morning, Monday, June 22nd.
By the summer of 2009, Susan had developed a cycle of selling sex on the streets and battling her drug addiction for years.
It was a day after Father's Day, it was the Monday, and she'd left my mum's house about 1 p.m. to go and get a methadone from a chemist in Bradford.
Susan was trying to break free from the drug addiction that was controlling her life and was taking this substitute to help.
She took a mobile phone with her. She said she was only going for a couple of hours. She never come back. Then my mum started getting a bit worried, where is she now? She started ringing the mobile phone, but no answer.
Hours had passed from Susan leaving the house, and it was uncharacteristic of her not to answer her phone.
And she was seen boarding the bus about just after 1 o'clock. And that's the last time anybody saw her, really. She just kind of vanished.
Susan's family nervously waited for her to make contact. But as night fell, they grew increasingly concerned. Despite her lifestyle and drug habit, she always made a point of keeping in touch with her mum.
Mum, she was anxious at where she was, but she thought maybe she met up with somebody. You know, she was always in touch with her mum. That's one thing she always did, keep in touch with her.
But Susan never made contact.
Hello, West Yorkshire Police.
Paul and his family took the decision to report her missing, as the painstaking hours without her turned into days.
It was just like a living nightmare. Weeks would go by and nothing would be said, and then there'd be an appeal on the TV or the local press.
I just want to appeal to anyone out there who knows or seen my mum.
And police had searched local beauty spots and nothing would be found. Contacting local hospitals and she wasn't in the hospital.
Not a clue, mate, not a clue.
Police questioned some drug dealers and a person quite close to Susan, but to no avail.
Have you ever used a prostitute?
No.
Never?
Never.
They did search quite a wide area local to Susan, where Susan was living at the time. They even dredged Manningham Park Lake and searched woodland close by.
All right, working.
They did talk to other working girls in Bradford, and missing persons posters put up around Bradford for Susan.
Despite extensive searches and numerous television appeals, Susan Rushworth had vanished. And further news was to confirm that something sinister could have happened to the mother of 3. Susan's mobile phone and bank cards had not been used since the day she disappeared.
Oh, Susan.
Today's best mix for Huddersfield, Halifax, Bradford and Keighley. We are the Pulse of West Yorkshire.
Bradford, West Yorkshire, June 2009. A young mother has been reported missing after going to collect a drug prescription.
It's totally out of character for her, as I've said. We are obviously very concerned about where she is at this moment in time.
A sex worker in the local red light district, Susan Rushworth often had to deal with the harder side of life, but had never vanished before.
We had some hope that maybe Susan were fed up of her lifestyle she was leading, and for a final break she'd maybe gone off to some kind of rehab centre, maybe without telling anybody.
But this would have been an unusual step for Susan, and as the days turned into weeks, then months, her family lived on a knife edge, desperate for any news.
We are very worried about her. We're a close family. We're not coping very well.
I just felt anxious all the time, just looking over my shoulder, kept looking, facing the crowd.
In desperation, Paul took to searching the streets of Bradford for his sister.
You haven't seen this woman, have you?
Even questioning the other girls where she usually worked. One of which was 31-year-old Shelley Armitage.
Have you seen this woman?
Shelley was well known in the area. Her reasons for turning to prostitution sadly echoed Susan's.
Well, we never knew she worked on the streets. You'd hear things, but you wouldn't accept it. Shelley had a good personality. She was always bubbly and that. She'd always try to help anyone. She started with the drugs, which we didn't know about at first. We just picked it up as things went on. And that's when everything seemed to change.
Shelley was just 16 years old when she became addicted to heroin.
It's the drug that's telling Shelley what to do at the end of the day. When she needs that drug, she needed that drug, and she'd do all to get that drug.
There's not many girls out there that do it for just the money. It's the addiction, not the, they don't want to do what they're doing. It's the fact that they need to do it to make their money to get the drug.
Despite a good upbringing, Shelley's life was blighted as the Class A drug took hold. The addiction became so powerful that she turned to selling her body on the streets in order to feed her habit.
You do hear rumours and you hear talk of it, and I think the main thing is you don't ever want to believe that it's true.
Shelley was desperate to shield her family from the harsh realities of prostitution, dealing with regulars and complete strangers, and risking her safety each night.
You're listening to the Pulse of West Yorkshire. It's 1 o'clock on Monday the 26th of April. We've got the very latest West Yorkshire news and weather.
I went in town with Jill, and she'd come round the corner.
Almost a year had now passed since Susan Rushworth had been reported missing. In the spring of 2010, Shelley Armitage was in town.
Come over to talk to us and saying to us that she was okay, you know what I mean?
Shelley and her parents stood talking before heading their separate ways. Little did they know their world would change from that moment on.
We went his own way, obviously Shelley went her way, and that was it. She rung Gemma up.
I spoke to her twice that day, actually. It was about 3 o'clock. She told me that she'd ring me back. I think she'd just seen somebody. She seemed just fine, and we were just chatting about normal things, and I asked her where she was, and she said she was in town with a friend. It was just such a normal conversation. Nothing crossed my mind. I just thought that she'd ring me back. And she'd not rung me back by, I think it was about 7 o'clock, so I tried to ring her back and she never answered.
Welcome to messaging service. The person you are calling is...
Shelley never called her sister again, and when she failed to return home, her boyfriend decided to raise the alarm.
Hi, you through to West Yorkshire, please.
Craig had rung the police, and at first I don't think there were a real issue straight away until obviously a day passed or whatever and nobody had seen her. And when she didn't go for a supplement payment, we knew there was something wrong.
When we knew that she'd not collected her benefits and she wasn't collecting her methadone, as each day went on, it was just, things were getting more intense. Like our family, we spent day and night on the streets looking for her. I'd go up as much as I could. Literally took over my life. I was off work and just tried to do everything we could, just asking for answers, and I think they got fed up of me because I was like there so much, asking the same question, but there was just no answers.
Shelley Armitage and Susan Rushworth were now missing. Both working the same area, but with no connections, and there had been no sightings reported of either of the girls. The police began their inquiries for Shelley, but despite being a popular girl, no one had seen her since the 26th of April.
Well, everything runs through your mind. You don't know what's happened, do you? You know, you think of all sorts. Has she been kidnapped? There's all sorts you think of.
2 weeks on from her disappearance, West Yorkshire police released footage of what they believe could be the last images caught of Shelley. Would this footage of her walking along Sunbridge Road in Bradford jog anyone's memory and help officers to find Shelley safe and well? West Yorkshire police are investigating the disappearance of 2 young women in the area. Susan Rushworth has been missing for almost 12 months, and Shelley Armitage has recently vanished after a trip into the local town. Officers are hoping that inquiries and CCTV footage of Shelley could shed some light onto a stalling investigation.
The police were good, they did everything they could. We knew the searches and everything that were going on. We went down for searches.
What's going on?
Went looking ourselves, you know what I mean, asking people.
Despite the CCTV footage and extensive searches, no firm leads brought any news on Shelley's whereabouts.
I'd seen it on the news that Susan Rush was missing. But Susan, she'd also told me that Shelley were missing. She kept saying, they haven't found Shelley, Mum.
Suzanne Blaymyers was another sex worker in the same area as Shelley Armitage and Susan Rushworth. She was 36 years old.
I even spoke to Susan when Shelley was missing.
With the red light district covering a small area in Bradford, news of now Shelley's disappearance spread to the other girls as family members searched for any news.
It's no deterrent, is it? You know, it didn't stop the other girls going down there. She used to say it's like being on a merry-go-round. I get up and I go out to earn the money to buy me drugs, and I go home, I sleep all day. I mean, she had no friends. Only people she really saw were us. She didn't go socialising with anybody because she didn't have a social life.
Suzanne resorted to selling her body to pay for her drug addiction, a story not dissimilar to that of Susan and Shelley's.
Suzanne will have been 21 or 2 when she started on the heroin. She always used to be really bubbly, full of herself, so full of confidence. Everybody liked Suzanne. She had loads of friends. She was really happy. She was always the centre of attention. A lot of them used to go raving and they used to dance all night. At first it was just recreational drugs, but when we found out she was taking heroin, we were devastated, absolutely devastated. But we didn't really know what to do because they want the information there is now. Me and my husband didn't know anybody who took drugs. They just hit the estates at that time. They were like an epidemic. Tried everything.
Where do you think you're going? I'm going nowhere.
At one stage, your dad locked her in the house. He thought if he locked her in, she'd get better.
You're staying in tonight.
Dad, please, I need to get out. Dad! Dad! Dad!
Eventually, I said, what are you doing? Where are you getting all this money? Because she had loads of money.
So, come on, talk to me.
Working.
Working where?
She said, you know, I've been working down in the red light area and I was absolutely crucified by it.
On the street.
Despite Nicky's best efforts, Suzanne was pulled deeper into the devastating world of drugs. And just a few years on, her life had changed beyond recognition. By 25, she had turned to prostitution, just like Susan and Shelley, to get enough money for the heroin that now ruled her existence. As the hunt for Shelley and Susan continues in vain, Suzanne begins her day as normal.
She stayed the night, she wasn't so well. And on the Friday morning, I dropped her off home because I was working. So I dropped her off early in the morning. And she said, "I'll see you later, Mum. I'll ring you tonight."
Suzanne, be careful. I'll call you later.
Nikki continued on to work, expecting to hear from her daughter later that evening.
She didn't ring that night. But I wasn't worried, because Suzanne started going out later than everybody else.
But the following day, a knock at the door was to change everything.
And on the Saturday, about 4 o'clock, a boyfriend knocked at the door.
Okay.
Hey, have you seen Suzanne?
I said, "What do you mean?"
No, she's yours, isn't she?
No, she's not, no.
She's at her flat. He said, "No, she ain't at her flat. I've been to the flat."
Please, we better get down to the police station quick now.
All right, okay, go on. All right.
Go on, hurry.
And I knew instantly there was something wrong.
Police say they'll never give up the search for the 3 missing women. A search described today.
3 women, all of whom worked in the same area, had now disappeared. The police launched their 3rd missing person inquiry and started the hunt for Suzanne.
They went and searched her flat and were asking about if anybody had seen her. It's just surreal when they come and tell you, you know. They were out looking, searching, trying to find what had happened, and I called my family and said, "You know, Suzanne's missing."
Suzanne Blamires is now the 3rd prostitute to have been reported missing in Bradford in the last 12 months. Just as police mount their search for her and begin inquiries, they receive evidence that would disturb even the most hardened detectives. Homefield Court is a block of flats in a converted mill at the heart of the red light district in Bradford. 3 days after Suzanne's disappearance, the caretaker was routinely reviewing the CCTV footage when he was to make a sickening discovery.
The caretaker contacted the police because of, what he'd seen, which was so extraordinary. He was just reviewing the CCTV footage of the weekend and, came across this horrific thing.
The chilling footage was hard to comprehend. It shows Suzanne following a man along a corridor and into his flat. Moments later, she attempts to flee.
I was sat on the couch, my sisters were there, and the police said to me, "We believe she's come to serious harm." They explained the caretaker had gone into work and reviewing the footage and come across it and rung the police. And every moment were captured on CCTV. He told me that, he'd chased her from the flat. And I just said, "She's dead, isn't she?" And he just kept saying, "No, we believe she's come to serious harm, Nicky." He said, "We know she's gone in this flat and she hasn't come out."
In an act of pure barbarity, the man is seen following Suzanne, armed with a loaded crossbow. Moments later, he pushes her to the ground and aims the weapon straight at her head, then drags her lifeless body back into his flat.
He said, "It was actually on CCTV. It's been captured in the corridor."
Actual footage showing her daughter being harmed was hard enough for Nikki to comprehend, but the horror didn't end there.
Like the police said, she wasn't in there seconds. She'd straight away realised there was something really wrong with him, or she'd seen something. The police actually told me that when he first fired the crossbolt at her, he missed.
2 bolts had been fired at Suzanne. The second hit her head at close range. After dragging her along the corridor, he then returns and gestures to the camera. As Nikki attempted to take in the incomprehensible news about the gruesome attack on her daughter, police swooped on Homefield Court to arrest the suspect. A 40-year-old local man by the name of Stephen Griffiths. And tellingly for a monster who had acted in such a brazen manner, he gave officers what they were looking for. Here we have access to chilling footage from Stephen Griffiths' police interview.
Why did you feel the need to kill her?
Just sometimes you kill someone to kill yourself or kill parents. I don't know. It's like deep issues inside me.
This cryptic confession was further proof that Griffiths had murdered Suzanne, possibly with the second bolt to her head. But despite this admission on the killer's part, detectives had not located a body in his flat.
When Griffiths was arrested, there was an element of him looking depressed. He had been caught. He had initially wanted to seemingly be willing to engage with the police investigation.
As detectives pressed Griffiths for more information, teams of officers scoured the area for any clues on Suzanne's whereabouts. And the news of the horrific murder was beginning to break across the country. Who was this man who had openly tortured a young woman, knowing that security cameras were present?
Seemed to be somebody that looked a little bit depressed, quite quiet, didn't really interact with a lot of people.
Rachel Farrington lived in Homefield Court near Griffiths for some years and struck up a friendship with him over a mutual interest in animals.
When you went into his flat, it were a bit like going in a maze, really. In tanks, he kept big monitor lizards. He did used to leave them to wander around on floor as well sometimes. It's a bit dismal and a bit grey, so it seemed a bit shabby. And then he picked a rat out of the box and he went, "Watch this, it's brilliant." And I went to the glass cage to watch and I saw this rat and it started shaking, and this big lizard came and it actually bit it in half. I felt a little bit sick, but he went, "Look at that, that's nature for you."
Billy Parkin had known Stephen Griffiths for nearly a decade and recalled some of his incredibly bizarre behaviour.
I was at his flat, and these little tiny baby rats, we just picked one out and ate it and swallowed it down with a glass of water.
Billy's recollection of his one-time friend echoed chilling stories of animal torture experienced by Griffiths' neighbour. He appeared to boast about his tendencies, hinting that his fixation with death went much further.
I didn't have much empathy for human beings. They'd also mentioned about he could have eaten somebody if he'd wanted to, or he obviously fantasised about cannibalism.
Go get us a beer.
He didn't know many other people. As time went on, it seemed to be ever diminishing his circle of friends.
At the time, friends may have believed Griffiths' morbid fascination with death was down to another element in his life.
He was a degree student, he'd got a first degree, a BA in psychology. Griffiths also was studying for a PhD, comparing modern-day murder techniques with techniques from, I think it was the 19th century. It was sort of a historic comparative study of murder techniques.
There may be an element, although this is difficult to prove, that he, in a sense, was educating himself better about the phenomenon that he was going to engage in practically. In other words, was he studying some of these books to understand how to avoid capture, how to dispose of bodies, how police would conduct an investigation?
Griffiths' obsession with the criminal mind had led him to study the area for many years. But this fascination with murder had ultimately crept into reality. And now he was toying with officers, revealing very little. Police only had the CCTV of Suzanne and other footage of Griffiths carrying items out of his flat, so any other leads were vital. As detectives pressed the killer for more information, forensic teams searched his home. But it was to be another discovery that was to elevate the horror of this investigation to another level.
said we'd found her. So they'd found her in the River Aire. He said to me, I've got to tell you, Nickell, he's dismembered her. A member of the public had reported seeing body parts.
4 days following Suzanne's disappearance, a gruesome discovery was made on the banks of a local river.
And I was just so shocked, so horrified. Like I say, I knew she was dead, but I never dreamt in a million years somebody had done that to her. And they found Suzanne's head in the rucksack. The crossbow bolt and the knife were still embedded in her head. And it'd taken her skin off.
Police officers in Bradford, West Yorkshire, have just made a gruesome discovery. A young woman's death has been captured on CCTV. With the suspect under arrest, he admits to the killing, but refuses to reveal the whereabouts of Suzanne's body.
Don't know.
Yet evidence discovered in a local river reveals more about the crime.
The news desk have picked up on these body parts that were found in the River Aire, and you start to think of things like the Yorkshire Ripper. Is it another serial killer who's a copycat of the Yorkshire Ripper? It's that geographical location, it's that sort of area, and it's such a powerful part of history, isn't it, really?
The killing did echo crimes committed by the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, a notorious madman who brutally murdered 13 women during the 1970s and 80s. Suzanne's body had been mutilated and parts of her left in the river. As forensic officers continued their search of the surrounding area, the footage of Suzanne's final moments found its way to the media and went global.
It really, really upset me when it appeared in the national press, you know. I was horrified, I was devastated.
To have CCTV of somebody killing somebody, murdering somebody, I mean, most killers would probably avoid CCTV cameras rather than, you know, play up to them, which is what he did.
As the country watched in horror, further remains were found in the river, and police made another breakthrough with Griffiths.
Are you saying that you've killed Susan Rushworth?
Yes.
And what was the other name?
Shelley Armitage.
Are you saying that you've murdered Shelley Armitage?
Yes.
Police come to tell us, you know, that they'd arrested a man and he confessed to murdering Susan. Yeah, it's just talking about that. Sorry.
There was still that little bit of hope that this could be just a real sort of lunatic that we're dealing with and that he could just be making this up.
But any hope Gemma and her family had was soon to be shattered. DNA tests made on some of the other remains discovered in the River Aire confirmed to be those of Shelley Armitage.
A few days later they found Shelley. Found a part of Shelley.
I'm very, very sorry to have to inform you about this.
I just felt numb, really. I just wanted to get out of the house. I wanted to know why and how and what were her last words.
But despite some clues and Griffiths' initial cooperation, when pressed for more information, the killer gave little away.
And what sort of location have you put them in? If you can't tell us where, what sort of location have you put them?
I don't know. Where a robot, where a computer would put it. You know, a rational, emotionless aberration would put it.
So why did you feel the need to kill any of the girls? Pardon?
I don't know.
Pardon?
I don't know. I don't know. Well, I'm misanthropic. I don't have much time for the human race.
This disregard for life and failure to fit into society had developed at an early age.
Stephen Griffiths was well known to the criminal justice system. He first got into serious trouble at the age of 17 when he attacked a supermarket manager with a knife who had stopped Griffiths from attempting to shoplift. Throughout his life, and two particular times, when Griffiths was 17 and when he was 22, he was assessed as having a personality disorder, and that, and in particular, that he had violent fantasies and fantasized about murdering.
Elements of Griffiths' past showed him to have homicidal tendencies. A man on the edge of society who had previously received psychiatric treatment. Griffiths also appeared to create an alter ego online and play out many of his dark thoughts for all to see.
He would sign himself on some of his Facebook pages and at times in Amazon as Ven Pariah. We might look at the Ven as being a shortening of Stephen, or indeed venerable, and Pariah obviously an outcast, somebody who was not quite accommodated within the kind of culture that he was trying to make his way within.
His alter ego as Vampiriah, and information that would not have been public and not have been there for public consumption was coming out very rapidly.
This is a man who's so narcissistic that any attention that he can get by changing his name or by playing with his name, by the kinds of clothes that he wore, the kinds of books that he was reading, he's trying to gain your attention, because by gaining your attention, he has power over you.
Details were coming out through Amazon about what he'd purchased. So, he'd bought crossbow bolts and the books he'd bought, the books he'd looked at, that all that information was coming out. I guess it just reflects the change in technology. If you purchase stuff from Amazon, for example, or if you've got a profile on Facebook, for example, then it's there for all to see.
I think he may have consciously been playing with his name. He certainly was consciously playing with his image. There were images of him on Facebook where he has his hair pulled back, where his hair was quite clearly neatly tied and oiled and greased. He perhaps was even wearing makeup. He doesn't care about the judgment that you make on him, because the judgment is irrelevant. It's the fact that you're prepared to give him the time of day. He admits at the time that he may have committed further murders, although crucially, we haven't found the body of one of his victims, and therefore that does imply that the kind of information he was giving to the police was very constrained indeed. And so I think is untrue, but it was a way of drawing attention to himself. It was a way of feeding his ego.
Despite body parts belonging to Suzanne and Shelley being found, police could not gain any information on the whereabouts of Susan's body from Griffiths.
Stephen Griffiths was driven to Bradford Magistrates Court this morning to face 3 murder charges, the alleged killing of 3 women in Bradford over the past month.
The killer's desperation for attention played out in the most sickening way when Griffiths first appeared in court.
The magistrate asked his name, and that's what he called himself.
My name is the Crossbow Cannibal.
He was very much a wannabe. He was part of our celebrity culture. He saw himself as part of that celebrity culture, and in fact was trying to manipulate that culture by, for example, at his first court appearance, saying that his name was the Crossbow Cannibal. Well, those 2 words, crossbow, the means by which he would kill his victims, was chilling enough. But the idea that he may also have eaten parts of his victims' bodies adds to the kind of horror of how he was identifying himself.
It was a terrible shocking thing. You can't be human. For a man to say he's eating other people's flesh. You're just not a human being.
6 months on from the disappearance of Shelley and Suzanne, and more than 18 months after the last sighting of Susan, Stephen Griffiths stood trial at Leeds Crown Court. The families of the women were to endure further torment as more graphic details of his sadistic crimes unfolded.
I can remember distinctly in court that they said it was 81 body parts, 81 separate parts of Suzanne Blamires. Susan Rushworth's not been found.
They don't have linked him to Susan's murder by DNA from blood samples and splatterings across his bathroom wall and in his bathroom, underneath his bath, and his bedroom. And they were quite disturbing to find blood on his boots a year later, virtually.
My heart were hammering just at seeing him. They just showed contempt for all the proceedings, basically. Details that came out in court were absolutely horrific. The police tell you what concerns your daughter, but they don't tell you what concerns the others. So some of the details, obviously, we hadn't heard. I felt physically sick when they said that they'd got DNA off the cooker belonging to the other girls, and, you know, it basically cooked them.
Further horrid details were to emerge, showing the crazed killer bounding his victims and taking images of their lifeless bodies.
Most of the serial killers that I've worked with, and most of the writing about literature about serial killers, will talk about taking trophies. In Griffiths' case, the trophies were photographs. It's a way of very deliberately putting himself back in the moment when he was about to take his victim's life. It was a way of reminding himself of that moment when he was all-powerful, when he was able to exercise the power of life and death over the women that he was going to kill.
You can't describe what it's like, you know what I mean? I'm seeing him sat there, you know. I mean, you just want to get to him, but you can't, you know what I mean?
Stephen Griffiths, you're charged. Following a highly charged trial, Stephen Griffiths was given 3 life sentences after pleading guilty to murdering Susan, Shelley and Suzanne. The judge said he would never be released.
Take him down.
Since his detainment, the evil killer has continued to try and exert his control.
He has attempted suicide and gone on hunger strike on a number of occasions. This is, frankly, fairly typical behaviour. It doesn't mean to imply that he's showing remorse, that he wants to take his own life, even though he's self-harming. This is a way, again, I think, of feeding his underlying narcissism. This is drawing attention to him, keeping his name known to the media. If you cannot control any other aspect of your life, but harming yourself with a razor blade or a sharp instrument, it is nonetheless a form of control.
Stephen Griffiths will face the rest of his life in prison. But the true sentence has been handed down to the families of his victims.
It's not a closure, there'll never be a closure to me till he's told me what he's done. Maybe I'm not going to find out, Shelley, but at least tell me what you've done.
I think we'll always wait for answers. I think we need answers. We're trying our best to move on, but I don't think we can ever until we find out where Susan is.
Shelley was a good kid. It was the drug that made her do what she did, but she was well respected, well known, smartly dressed, and she didn't deserve what happened to her.
But I just like to think of all the good and happy memories of her, and he's just doesn't sort of faze me now. I don't want to think about him.
Life doesn't seem the same without her. Yeah. She was my sister. She wasn't just my sister, she was my friend.
People say, oh, it gets easier with time. I'm not quite convinced I believe that. I know what my daughter did. I know what she was. And I'm not ashamed because I know what made her like she was. I'd like Suzanne to be remembered how she was before the drugs took hold of her. Happy, full of confidence, cheeky, just a star, really. I miss her every day of my life. There's never a day goes by when I don't think about her. And I think I'll feel like that while I die, probably.
In the early hours of the 25th of February 2000, a young child was brought to the intensive care unit of a central London hospital with signs of horrific physical abuse.
It was incredibly difficult to comprehend how anybody could do that to a child.
Despite the best efforts of the medical team, the girl died later that day. She was 8 years old.
The pathologist who carried out the post-mortem discovered injuries to every part of her body. As he put it, there wasn't a part of her that was spared.
The cause of her death and the investigation into how it was allowed to happen led to the most extensive inquiry into child protection in British history. It was a crime that shook Britain. St Mary's Hospital, London, and an 8-year-old girl was declared dead after a 13-hour battle for life. It was immediately clear to the doctors who tried to save her that the young child had been subjected to the most appalling treatment.
The doctors there talk of her core temperature being so low, they couldn't actually read the temperature on their normal equipment. When Dr. Carey examined her after she died, he found in excess of 120 injuries in her body. I mean, this poor child had fought these conditions for so many months, but eventually her body just gave up.
Suspicion immediately began to fall on the child's guardians.
Marie-Therese Coelho, who was her apparent carer, she was arrested at the time. And following her arrest, a day later, her boyfriend, Carl Don Manning, was arrested at the flat in Tottenham. And this is when the event started to begin to be unravelled.
It soon became clear to detectives that almost everything they thought they knew about the dead girl was wrong, even down to her identity. Only when police began to question the suspects did the real story begin to emerge, starting with the child's name, Victoria Climbié.
Victoria was born on the 2nd of November 1991 in Abobo, the village where she was brought up, which is a small village in Ivory Coast. She was a really happy child, sang all the time, danced about a lot.
She was a central figure within her family. She was very helpful. She was the entertainer of the family.
Shortly before her 7th birthday, Victoria and her family were visited by Marie-Therese Coelho, who was Victoria's great-aunt on her father's side. Coelho was 42 and had lived in France for some years. In October 1998, she returned to the Ivory Coast with a proposition for the Climbié family. She offered to take one of their children back to France and have the child educated.
This seemed to be an offer that would bring prosperity for Victoria. So they were happy with this, and this is a process that takes place in that area of the world on a regular basis, and it's tried and trusted, and this was a relative.
Coelho was somebody that they knew well. She was the head of the family at the time. She was a French citizen, apparently, from their perception, incredibly wealthy. One of the analogies that's been suggested to me is, somebody offering you, say, to send your child to, Eton or Harrow and then educate them at Oxbridge and all that would provide. And of course it's like that, but of course it's even greater. It's a much greater advantage than that. The kind of opportunity that would change your child's life forever.
In a twist of fate, it seems that Victoria was not the original child chosen by her aunt to take to Europe.
She had in mind another child initially who was called Anna. Went out to the Ivory Coast with a view to recruiting Anna, and Anna's parents said no. But Quao had already got the name Anna in her passport as her daughter, so that when she then subsequently recruited from the Climbié family, she didn't want to change the passport, so she just called Victoria Anna.
Now she had a child of a different name, so she had to attempt to defraud the authorities into believing that the child on the passport was in fact Anna Quao, and so she did that by obtaining some hair extensions and got her through the passport controls and the various border controls and went to Paris.
Quao took Victoria to Paris in November 1998. They stayed for approximately 5 months.
While she was in Paris, she lived in an apartment provided by the state. She was given benefits, and Victoria went to school. Although she only went to school for about 50% of the time because of the assaults and the abuse had started at that point. And the authorities in France started to take a very close look at this and started to threaten action because Victoria wasn't going to school.
With the net closing in, Quao decided to leave Paris and took Victoria to England in April 1999. The pair settled in London, and shortly after their arrival, Quao and Victoria visited Esther Aka, who was a distant relative by marriage of Marie-Therese.
I had just come from work, from the hospital. Then I saw this bubbly little girl smiling, jumping about.
Oh, this is Anna.
We started chatting. Obviously, the girl knew she wasn't Anna, but she was responding to Anna because she had been briefed that way.
It wasn't long before Esther began to sense something was wrong.
The only thing about the child was that the child was wearing a wig. And I found it very peculiar. And we took the wig off, in fact, and there were little blisters on the head. And he said the child had some either hot water accident or something. So, that's it. But the child was quite happy wearing the wig. When he took it off, he just put it back on.
6 weeks later, Esther Aka bumped into the pair in the street, and she was shocked at Victoria's appearance.
I noticed a scar on the right cheek of Victoria. And I said, what's happened to the child cheek, this bruising or scar? And she told me that the child fell from escalator. They were going to the city and fell down, and the escalator caused the bruising.
Esther was sufficiently worried about Victoria that she arranged to visit the pair at their new home, a hostel in Nickell Road, North London. Victoria had lost weight, and Esther was so concerned about both her health and her living conditions that she decided to take matters into her own hands.
I rang Brent Social Services. I had visited a girl called Anna. They lived in this address. I made it clear. And I told them my concerns, that the house wasn't very clean, was dirty, people were smoking, and the room was small and untidy, and Anna didn't look very well. I would want somebody to go there urgently to investigate. So whoever took the referral reassured me that somebody was going to go urgently.
Esther even made a second call to the social services to check on progress, and once again she was assured that action would be taken. In reality, nothing was done, and her report was lost in the system.
If a member of a community who was not trained as a frontline social worker, who was not trained as a professional, detected that Victoria was being neglected or had concerns around the welfare of Victoria and went on to notify the relevant authorities, I believe here the professional should have done better.
By the middle of June, Marie-Therese had secured a job at a local hospital. She had arranged that Victoria be looked after by a local childminder, Priscilla Cameron, and her daughter, Avril.
She stayed with us each day during the week. Quite friendly, liked to smile a lot, quite a lot. And she took a shine to my brother, Patrick.
Patrick managed to bring out, I think for the first time she's arrived in England, that entertaining nature from this child.
He was the only person she danced to. She loved dancing, and she was showing him what the local dance from her country was.
If she's ever had any time as a child should have been, it was that time she spent at the Camerons' house.
Despite the happiness and laughter, the Camerons noticed a change come over Victoria when it was time to go home.
When Mary arrived, straight away she'll be, talking to her in French, and from what I can see, it's not a good conversation. She looks agitated.
Quao would call Victoria wicked, which certainly by most people's standards is a fairly extreme term to use to describe a young girl.
I said to my mum, that doesn't seem right. Why would she come and, shouting at the child?
As well as their unease, Priscilla and her daughter began to notice something more sinister.
Mrs. Cameron started to notice things about Victoria's condition. Cuts on Victoria's fingers.
We asked Mary why she's got cuts on her fingers, and she said, she finds the razor blades and she just sits there and she just cuts herself. Well, we thought that was strange, because why would a child, just sit down and cut themselves with a razor blade?
At the beginning of July, Marie-Thérèse and Victoria moved into the flat of Marie-Thérèse's new boyfriend, Carl Manning, a bus driver she had met a month earlier. It was a relationship that would ultimately result in the torture and death of Victoria. Victoria Climbié had moved to the UK from the Ivory Coast in April 1999. Her aunt, Marie-Thérèse Quao, had convinced Victoria's parents to let her take their daughter to Europe to be educated. However, Victoria's well-being was the last thing on her aunt's mind. After a short stay in a hostel, Victoria and Marie-Thérèse had moved in with 26-year-old local man, Carl Manning.
They met on a bus. He was a bus driver. She met him, and she's a very manipulative individual and quite sophisticated. And within a very short period of time, phone numbers had been exchanged, and they then started to see each other. And an even shorter period of time, of course, she then moved into his flat. Manning was a lot younger than the Curio. He was a single man, didn't really have much of a social life, hadn't really had many girlfriends, supported himself, owned his own flat.
Manning lived in a bedsit in Somerset Gardens in Tottenham. It was a small flat. It consisted of a double bed and a sofa bed in one room, and then a kitchen and a tiny bathroom leading off that room.
In these cramped conditions, Quao and Manning began a relationship that left little room for Victoria.
It's pretty clear that Manning had a serious problem with Victoria and didn't want her around.
Victoria became more and more of a burden on the couple, and as a result, Quao decided on a drastic course of action.
She turned up with Anna and some bags with clothes in them, and she said to my mother that the person that she's living with, he doesn't want Anna there, so if my mother can keep her. So my mum said, listen, I'll keep her for the evening. It is late. I'll keep her for the night, and then tomorrow you've got to find somewhere for this child. You can't abandon this child. It is your child.
As Victoria entered the house, her appearance shocked the Camerons.
Anna had a hat on, and my mum said, Anna, you're in the house, take your hat off. She took the hat off, And then we saw these injuries. The injuries, some of them were fresh. So she was recently beaten. There was a cut over her right eye. There was a healing burn on her right cheek. It was horrific to see that. And out of all this girl was smiling. Yeah.
Faced with this appalling sight, Avril Cameron took Victoria to the Central Middlesex Hospital.
I went through what I thought what was happening, and I said, listen, I don't normally do this because it's someone else's child. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I'm seeing injuries, and I've took it upon myself to bring the child to the hospital. Eventually, sometime in the afternoon, the doctor saw us. She took about 2 hours to examine her from head to toe. And it's only when she took her clothes off that we saw more injuries, and there were strange marks. To which she asked me, do you know what these marks are? And I said, no. She said, these are cigarette burns, and they're all along her thighs. Across her back, there was a mark right across. And then there was one right across her legs. And she turned to me and she said, okay, I've done my examination, and I can say to you, these are non-accidental injuries. And she said, I will have to put certain things in place. So she said, the first thing I'll do, I'll ring social services. In my mind, I'm saying, well, at least something's happening now.
The following morning, however, a senior consultant diagnosed Victoria's injuries as scabies, an infectious disease that causes rashes on the skin.
Because people had suspected non-accidental injury, she was initially placed under police protection. But when the alternative diagnosis of scabies was mooted, that police protection was lifted. And there does seem to have been a problem with that hospital about coordination of these different diagnoses and different opinions about what might be happening to Victoria. But the effect, in any event, was that Victoria was kept in one night and was then discharged back home to Quao.
I just felt angry, frustrated, and sort of feeling of hopelessness, because I knew what I saw. And for the doctor to say rashes, excuse me, what about the burn on her face, the cut over her eyes? I'm not a medical person, but I know the difference between a rash and a cut.
Apart from a brief glimpse of her walking down the street, the Camerons were never to see Victoria alive again. Only a week later, she would be back in hospital.
Victoria was taken to the North Middlesex Hospital by Quao. The explanation was that Victoria had scalded herself in the bath. Quao said that in an attempt to alleviate the itching from the scabies, Victoria had held her own head under the hot tap. A rather surprising explanation given the severity of the scalds.
When you look at those graphic injuries and the burning of Victoria's face, one thing that Marie-Therese could never have taken away from Victoria was that smile.
There were some amazing stories coming from some of the nurses about Victoria. And one thing, even though it's 10 years ago, one piece of evidence will always stay in my mind from one especially caring nurse who'd spent a lot of time with Victoria. And she describes providing Victoria with some dressing up clothes from a dressing up box that the hospital kept. And she described this pretty little girl dressed up in pink Wellington boots and some sort of party outfit, going twirling down the ward, full of happiness and joy, and described by nurses then and subsequently as a little ray of sunshine.
Although Victoria appeared to have enjoyed her time on the ward, nurses began to notice a change come over her on the rare occasions that Quao visited.
I think it's recorded on the nursing notes that the relationship between Quao and Victoria is more master and servant than that of mother and daughter, and that there's a really vivid description of Quao telling Victoria off. And Victoria is standing to attention out of her hospital bed, and she's actually so frightened that she wet herself.
Not only were those signs missed, but evidence that Victoria was suffering serious physical harm was also tragically overlooked.
One nurse noted a belt buckle mark. Another noticed burns to Victoria.
And this is the point at which everything did go very badly wrong, because if everything had been brought together properly, social services would have and should have called a child protection conference. And that's when everybody, all the professionals and all the different aspects of a child's life can come together and share your notes and your concerns.
This conference was never called. And despite the seemingly mounting evidence, a series of misunderstandings and ineffective communication between medical staff, social services and the police meant that the signs of Victoria's abuse that should have prompted action by the authorities were ignored. She was discharged on the 6th of August and returned to Carl Manning's flat.
Somehow the doctor's concerns and the nurses' concerns, there had been nurses who had been worried too, people didn't bring it together. And at some level at the hospital they said, fine, you can take the child home.
I mean, not really looking to blame at anyone, but at no time, in no way, Victoria Climbié should have been returned in the hands of Marie-Thérèse Quao.
On leaving the hospital, Victoria's case became the responsibility of Haringey Social Services.
She had been assigned to a social worker called Lisa Arthurworry.
Lisa Arthurworry had only been qualified for 18 months, and that's pretty new for a social worker.
She ought to have been subject to really quite close supervision by those senior to her, and she was not.
Initially, her task was to check that everything was all right. So it was a let's see how things look at home.
Mr. Manning?
Yes.
I'm here to see Marie-Thérèse.
When Lisa went to visit this family at their house, it seemed to her to be a much better house or flat than most of the other families she was visiting. It was neat, it was tidy, it was clean. Manning and Quao were well presented, the child was well presented, the child seemed happy.
Although Lisa Arthurworry was satisfied with Victoria's living conditions, tellingly she admits never actually speaking to her in person. Had she done so, perhaps she would have uncovered quite how desperate Victoria's life was becoming.
As the abuse of Victoria got worse, she started to become incontinent. And it got so bad, and the sofa she was sleeping on got so badly soiled, that Quao and Manning threw it out, with the result that Victoria now had nowhere to sleep. The solution that Quao and Manning came up with in that situation was to force Victoria to sleep in the bathroom.
As if these conditions were not appalling enough, the winter of 1999 marked a significant increase in the physical abuse Victoria was subjected to.
This child began to sustain some of the most extreme physical abuse I've ever come across.
The murder of Victoria Climbié shocked Britain. An 8-year-old girl from the Ivory Coast, brought to the UK by a relative, Victoria was subjected to the most horrific abuse, eventually leading to her death at the hands of her aunt, Marie-Thérèse Quao, and her aunt's partner, Carl Manning. By the autumn of 1999, Victoria had been seen by 2 local hospitals, 3 separate social services, and the police. Despite this, the abuse she was subjected to had been allowed to carry on. Social worker Lisa Arthurworry had visited Victoria at Manning's flat and was satisfied that she was being properly cared for. Like everyone who came into contact with the pair, she assumed that she was dealing with a mother and her daughter. The previous August, Quao had applied for a council house, and in October, Lisa had arrived to deliver the result of the application.
Lisa made a second visit to Quao, and she went and told her that their housing application had been unsuccessful. She got very upset, and Victoria, this is an example of how well trained she was, chipped in and appeared almost to, with hindsight, to have been taught to say this, said, "Why can't you find us a home? You do not respect my mummy." But Lisa said, no, this is the situation, and basically we could only find accommodation for you if the child was at risk in some way. And she left. That's October the 28th. 3 days later, she receives a phone call from Quao, who's hysterical.
I want to make an appointment. In fact, I want to come in straight away.
Who claims that the child has been abused by Manning. Lisa immediately says, you must come to the office straight away. And she comes with the child. Now, the alarm bells immediately rang for the social workers because, amongst other things, Quao brought Manning, who supposedly was abusing this little girl, with her. And they were sitting, all three of them, in the waiting room.
Quao was interviewed by Lisa and a colleague, who explained the implications of her allegation.
It was made clear to her that this was a very serious situation, and it would trigger all sorts of repercussions, including that Carl Manning would be arrested, possibly remanded in prison, and Victoria would need to be examined, all sorts of things like that. The measure this gives you of the woman is an utterly heartless woman who would have subjected an innocent child to the traumatic procedures of a sexual abuse investigation just to get her hands on the key to a council flat. And that probably, with hindsight, should have triggered deep alarms about her moral character and the strength of her maternal feeling to this little girl.
Tragically, these signs went unnoticed, and when Quao realised the implications of her allegation, she quickly withdrew it. Given the seriousness of the situation, and despite the retraction, it seems unthinkable that Victoria will be allowed to stay in the same flat as Carl Manning. Nevertheless, this is exactly what happened. Victoria returned to Somerset Gardens, leaving the social workers to decide on further action.
What happens next is 15 actions were decided for Lisa to enact. She wrote to Quao suggesting a meeting, got no reply. She rang her mobile, her messages were ignored. She made a spot visit, 6:30 after work in her own time, banged on the door, no reply. She requested police assistance in tracing her, nothing much happened. She didn't know what else she was supposed to do.
Although Lisa was unclear on her next course of action, it seems her managers had already made the decision for her.
The manager instructed, and this is a direct quote, complete appropriate paperwork, then NFA, meaning no further action. And basically she was told to close the case. So she closed the case, as she'd been told to do.
Victoria's file was closed, and probably one of the last chances to save her life had been missed. She would not be seen by any professionals from the health or social services for the next 4 months, during which time she would be subjected to the most inhumane conditions imaginable.
She was put to bed every night in an unheated, unlit bathroom, wrapped up inside a black plastic bin liner with no blankets or sheets. She was, in addition, tied so that she couldn't get out. Her hands were tied with masking tape, and the bag was tied up around her.
The treatment of her as she got weaker seemed to be getting worse. They're not feeding her, and then they're giving her her food on a plastic plate, and they're tying up her hands so she couldn't even eat with her hands at the end.
Victoria could only eat by pushing her face into the plate like a dog might, except, of course, that dogs aren't normally tied up in black plastic bin liners. So the conditions were about as appalling as it's possible to imagine. There were attempts by social workers to call on her towards the end of her life, and they would ring the doorbell, and nobody would come. And after they'd done this 2 or 3 times, they concluded that Quao and Manning must have moved away, and so they did nothing about it. Whereas in truth, the chances are that on the other side of that doorway was a deserted flat with a little girl tied up in a bath. The state she was in must have been indescribable. And I think it made it worse that she never knew if this was ever going to end.
On the few occasions that Victoria left Manning's flat during this period, Quao would take her to local churches, claiming that possession by evil spirits were causing Victoria's injuries and incontinence.
On the 24th of February, Quao took Victoria to one of the churches she'd attended. Somebody at the church looked at Victoria and could see just how appallingly unwell she was and insisted that Quao took her to hospital. They got a taxi, and the taxi took her to an ambulance station, and the ambulance took her to the North Middlesex Hospital, where she was admitted in a shocking state. She was suffering from hypothermia. Her body temperature had fallen so far that the hospital couldn't find a thermometer with the capacity to read her body temperature. The injuries to her body were too numerous to count, and she was dying. When it became clear that the North Middlesex could do no more for her, they arranged for her to be transferred to the paediatric intensive care unit at St Mary's, Paddington, and she was transported there by ambulance. The staff at St Mary's did all they could for her, but sadly later that day, during the course of the afternoon, Victoria, who was then aged 8 years and 3 months, passed away.
The death of Victoria Climbié marked the start of a police investigation and trial that would uncover one of the worst cases of child abuse in British history, one that would result in dramatic changes to the law. Victoria Climbié arrived in the UK in April 1999. She was brought by her aunt Marie-Thérèse Quao on the pretense of providing the child with a Western education. In reality, Victoria was part of Quao's plan to access benefits, and when the plan went awry, Victoria bore the brunt of her aunt's frustration and violence. She was subjected to months of appalling physical abuse, living in horrific conditions, until, in February 2000, her body simply gave up, and she died. Victoria's aunt was immediately arrested at the hospital, and a murder investigation was launched.
If I come back against you, that work.
Once we started to interview Marie-Thérèse, it was very clear that she was attempting to obstruct the police. She wasn't being straightforward with her answers, and she wouldn't assist or cooperate in any way, and denied any allegations that were put to her.
Quao's boyfriend, Carl Manning, was arrested the following day at his flat in North London. In his interview, detectives were taken aback by his honesty.
Manning spoke of how she'd been assaulted with a bicycle chain, causing injuries to her body and her head. He also used a shoe to assault her, he punched her, and later in the trial we discovered that Marie-Thérèse used a hammer to hit her feet.
He said in answer to one of our questions that that was the thing about Victoria. You could hit her time and time again and she could always take it, which is sickening.
Along with the interview statements, detectives also visited Manning's flat to collect forensic evidence.
We discovered that there were many bottles of bleach there, and this flat had been cleaned. And given that Manning had not been arrested until the day after Quao had been arrested, then he'd obviously used that time to try and clean the flat. But even though the bleach had been used, our forensic techniques managed to recover samples of blood from the walls and the bath, from furniture in the main room, and from furniture in the bedroom as well. And we managed to recover many, many samples of blood. Now, given that they'd already been cleaned, I think that gave an indication of exactly what had happened there. She had been assaulted regularly and severely, and she'd bled. And even though they'd attempted to cover this up, it must have been in abundance. We found tapings that had been abandoned. They'd been thrown out with the rubbish, but we managed to recover those. And these were clearly the bindings that had been used to restrain Victoria by her wrists and her ankles.
As well as the search for forensic evidence, detectives were also tasked with positively identifying who the dead girl was. Throughout her life in the UK, she was known as Anna. A passport found in Manning's flat seemed to confirm this, but detectives were shocked when they realised the picture of the child in the passport was not the girl now lying in a London mortuary. After weeks of investigation, police managed to contact who they thought were her parents, currently 3,000 miles away in the Ivory Coast.
And that was a very difficult conversation because we had trained family liaison officers, but they were ringing to find out whether or not this child was their child, and then to inform them that this child had died. They were able to confirm that Victoria had gone with Marie-Therese, and at that point we started to realise that this was their child, and she was in fact Victoria Climbié. And we had to then bring them over for the worst journey of their lives to come to the UK and identify their child.
With Victoria positively identified and buoyed by the mounting evidence, the detectives felt confident they had a solid case against Quao and Manning.
Marie-Therese Carrera and Carl Manning were both charged with murder, and they appeared before a jury at the Old Bailey on the 20th of November, and that trial lasted until the 12th of January.
This was never going to be a straightforward case, or indeed an easy case. Marie-Therese Quao's defence was that Victoria's condition was due to the fact that she was possessed by demons.
There will be times when what they say may cause you distress.
And she maintained that throughout. Carl Manning, on the other hand, realising from an early stage that he was probably going to have to accept his responsibility for ill-treating this child, his defence was, although I'm responsible for injuring her, at the time that I injured her, I didn't intend to cause her really serious bodily harm, and I certainly didn't intend to kill her.
Whilst Manning at least accepted some responsibility, Quao, on the other hand, showed no remorse whatsoever. Her behaviour throughout the trial shocked everyone present.
The way she chuckled in such a menacing way and laughed dismissively. Yes, it made the hairs stand on the back of my neck. This is the only time I have genuinely felt I was in the presence of evil.
The jury took 4 days to convict, and during that time there was a lot of speculation. But eventually, the jury returned a guilty verdict for murder on both defendants.
During the course of the trial, Quao and Manning never once offered a satisfactory explanation as to why they treated Victoria in the way they did. They were sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Victoria Climbié. Despite the murderers being convicted, it was clear that questions as to how this was allowed to happen still remained unanswered. For this reason, the British government ordered that a public inquiry be set up to investigate the circumstances surrounding Victoria's death.
Well, the reason why Parliament decided to establish the inquiry was because, first of all, the nation was shocked by the suffering of this poor little girl that had come to this country for a better education and for new life opportunities. But secondly, it wasn't as if this child died unknown to the key services. In fact, the opposite was the case.
She'd had contact with 4 different local authorities. She'd been on the books of 2 different police child protection teams. She'd been admitted to 2 different hospitals. And yet she was still being described as a housing case by the end of her life.
Victoria's parents were invited to attend the inquiry and were present throughout the proceedings. During the criminal trial, they were called as witnesses and therefore excluded from much of the evidence heard at the Old Bailey. This would be the first time they would hear first-hand accounts of what had happened to their daughter. Everyone who had contact with Victoria, from friends and neighbours to social workers, hospital staff and police officers, were asked about their actions and to explain them. The inquiry also made a legal first when the decision was made to call Victoria's murderers to give evidence.
Quao wouldn't cooperate and wouldn't give her evidence by video link as we had asked her to, whereas Manning did. Quao, as a result, had to be brought from prison to give evidence.
Please provide me with more detail.
She was a fairly extraordinary witness. She was not prepared to answer any questions, in truth. She just wanted to rant at the world.
It was an absolute pantomime from the minute she walked into the room.
I said I've not done anything. So I don't know why you're all looking at me like I'm guilty.
She was shrieking at the top of her voice and refusing to sit down, and then when she sat down after shrieking, refusing to answer questions initially and just being very, very difficult.
One of the most shocking moments in the inquiry room was during Quao's evidence when she turned on Victoria's parents, the parents of the girl she had murdered.
She was pointedly trying to make comments to them that she knew would hurt them.
I know what I do to you if I have my way. Especially you looking like that.
She suggested that they weren't legally married, and hadn't been married in a church, which of course is of no significance at all to anybody in the scheme of everything. But to them, it was a particularly hurtful insult, and it was directed to hurt. And it just seemed that after everything that had happened, not 1 ounce of remorse, not one acceptance of anything, and just looking for ways to injure them more than she'd done already.
They sat in front of me every day throughout the inquiry, and I thought that they were not only brave, but they were dignified. And I think that they commanded the respect of everybody in the room.
Amongst the hundreds of witnesses called to the inquiry was Lisa Arthurworry, who had bore the brunt of the press outrage surrounding Victoria's death.
When Lisa Arthurworry gave evidence, she was in a very fragile state. I did feel somewhat sorry for her, because as I have said, I don't feel that she was the principal villain in the piece by any stretch of the imagination. She was a young, overworked social worker, not properly supervised, whose managers let her down.
The Climbié inquiry ran for over a year, and more than 160 witnesses were called. At the end of the process, it was clear that Victoria had been let down by those entrusted with her well-being.
The report concluded that there were at least 12 occasions during the course of Victoria's short life in the UK when agencies had the chance to intervene and save her and missed them.
This was not the failure of one individual member of staff in whichever service, and it was not due to somebody, one individual, missing some important factor. The whole system failed, and that was the most compelling aspect of the inquiry.
The real people responsible for Victoria's death were Quao and Manning, the two convicted of her murder. And I think it's important not to lose sight of that when you're reviewing what the agencies could and should have done. Nonetheless, there were faults in what the agencies had done, and the inquiry's report makes recommendations for changes to the way they work. Those changes have been reflected in legislation with the passing of a new Act of Parliament and in the passage of new guidance that is now used by social work departments up and down the country.
In future, services for children must be centred not around the interests of any organisation, but around the interests of the child.
The life of Victoria Climbié was tragically short, but through the tireless work of the foundation set up in her name, her death at least has had some positive outcomes. The foundation is striving to become an independent centre of excellence to develop best practice for all those involved in the field of child protection. Their other aim goes back to the heart of Victoria's story, the quest for a better life for a child. through education.
I think Victoria's legacy really lies on the promise we made to Mr. and Mrs. Climbié to build a school in Victoria's hometown. Today we have built and finished a school which has an intake of 360 children. Now, all these children had not been, the building of that school might have not been able to access education.
Above all, it is abundantly clear that Victoria in some way touched everyone who was involved in her story.
Be they relatives, neighbours, or the professional staff. They all described Victoria in warm, personal, responsive terms.
As my brother Patrick once commented, when she smiles, she lights up the room.
I think that picture of her with her hair tied up in bunches, you know, next to the pot plant that featured so frequently will probably always be in my mind, actually.
As long as I live, Victoria will be with me.